Welcome to session 50 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This is a lecture and discussion series that has been going on now. It's in its 6th year. And originally it started out as a face-to-face gathering at the Brookfield Public Library, a monthly series where we'd focus on narrative worlds and philosophical themes, in particular speculative fiction authors. With COVID, we've gone online, and so we do these videos, and then we follow them up with some more in-depth, intensive, and engaging Zoom sessions. And I made a little change to this particular session. I originally had it scheduled that we were going to try to go through this entire trilogy by R. Scott Bakker, the Prince of Nothing series, and as I began to reread The Darkness That Comes Before, I realized that, no, that's way too much to try to take on in a single session. So what we're going to do is this session is going to be devoted entirely to the first book in the series, The Darkness That Comes Before, and then we'll do another subsequent one on the Warrior Prophet, and then finish it up with the Thousandfold Thought. So we're actually devoting 1/4 of the year to R. Scott Bakker's first part of his Second Apocalypse series, because there are 4 other books coming after that in a second series. So we're just focusing on the first trilogy, and the reason that it's not just a matter of length that made me decide that we need to spend the entire session just on this book. It's also how incredibly rich and dense and complex and philosophically oriented the world building is, and the philosophical themes are in this work, particularly through some, rather conventional ways of introducing ideas, with the little selections from philosophers who R. Scott Bakker has created, or the history of the events with Akhmanian, one of the main characters writing it, but also all the discourses that are going on with these characters. There's so much going on that in order to really do justice to it and to introduce people well to the series, which I highly recommend you read, it's really quite wonderful, we really need to focus on one book at a time and take them a bit slower than we might if it was a different writer and a different trilogy. So, as usual, we're going to talk a lot about the book itself, but we're also going to discuss the biography of the author, in this case, a still living and still relatively young author, just a few years older than me. And we're going to also talk about the world building itself and how that, in some respects, comes out of his biography in interesting ways. And then we'll jump into the philosophical themes. Much of what we're going to do here is laying the groundwork for talking about these other 2 in our subsequent follow-up sessions, which would be number 51 and 52, devoted to these 2 books as well and the ongoing developments. So there's a lot to cover, and let's jump right in. With R. Scott Bakker, his biography is a natural starting point for several different reasons, which we'll go into here. The first reason is that it's an unfinished biography, and there's a lot of things sort of left open within how it's going, and that kind of parallels the set of books that this trilogy is a part of, and then the follow-up 4 volumes, The Unholy Consult, because there's other volumes that are supposed to come after that in this Second Apocalypse series called the No God sequence. We don't know how many books are going to be in it. Some people say 2. we're still waiting on Bakker to bring those out. Nobody actually knows at this point in time when those books are going to arrive. It's sort of like George R. R. Martin, Song of Ice and Fire, who, by the way, Bakker credits as being incredibly important. He said that George R. R. Martin, as a speculative fiction writer, really opened a lot of doors and made it possible for Bakker to be able to do the sort of work that he's doing with the Second Apocalypse. So there's that aspect. The world building is incredibly connected in important ways with Bakker's biography in a number of different manners that we're going to see intersecting with each other. And, there's some other aspects as well. It's difficult to get hard information on a lot of things in his biography, just going online. And nobody's written a biography of Bakker as far as I can tell. So in a way, he's almost sort of like one of his own characters who, we know a lot about as they reveal themselves over time. Maybe we'll learn a lot more in the future. So let's just jump right into his biography. R. Scott Bakker is born in Simcoe, Ontario in 1967. So he's, roughly a contemporary for me. He'd be like an older kid at school, when I was at school myself. And he, we don't know that much about his own childhood. He doesn't tell us an awful lot about it, unless there's parts of his blog that I haven't gotten to yet. But there is something that we can say. In 1984, he begins developing the world, Earwa, the continent that all of the things, all of the events, all of the developments in these stories are happening in. And so this is going back a long, long way, right? This is when he's essentially a teenager and before he goes to college. So he's in high school, and how does it happen? Comes out of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And so we should pause for a moment and talk a little bit about the significance of Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy, or even we could say speculative fiction role-playing. I'm guessing that quite a few people who are watching this or listening to this have actually participated in role-playing games in whatever venue they have. I've actually, I remember playing role-playing games in middle and high school and college when I was in the Army. Haven't done it too much since, but it was something very enjoyable, and it was an incredibly important part of my life for quite a few years, and I imagine it was similarly so for Bakker. So D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, was in the 1980s easily the most successful and well-known role-playing game. It came out originally from, tabletop miniatures games and got more and more complex over time. There's a whole story to be told there that I don't need to rehearse. I will say this. By 1984, you had a really complete system. There were, if I remember right, either 5 or 6 actual books as opposed to like little paperback things, but hardcover books that you could buy. You'd find them at hobby stores, right? There was the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook and Monster Manual and Deities and Demigods. And then there were some other ones, and I don't really recall the names of them. And there was a world that you could play in that was sort of like the official world, Greyhawk, which there was a giant map with hexagons on it, and all of these places on the map, each with their own sort of ethnicity and backstory and history, and you could play what we called campaigns in those, where you weren't just doing one single module, but actually like playing an entire world thing. And Dungeons and Dragons drew on a lot of fantasy influences. Obviously, Tolkien was a big deal. They had to rename hobbits halflings because the estate went after them. Robert Howard's Conan and other things fit in there. Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and Newhan world were important. Michael Moorcock, we could go on and on and on and on. As a matter of fact, in Gary Gygax's Dungeons Master's Guide, there was an essay about some of the literature that one might read to get ideas. And one of the cool things about D&D, as well as so many other role-playing games, is it had all this scope for the imagination in several different ways. So each person would create a player character, right? And they would interact with monsters and non-player characters through the game master, the dungeon master in D&D. So you have to engage in some role-playing. And some people were good at this, some people were not good at it. Others, were kind of problematic because they were only interested in maxing out their inventory or their levels, and they'd be what we call rule lawyers, and they were not a lot of fun to play with. But the people or there were others I will mention too, who wanted to be show-offs, they'd be kind of a drab, dull character, and then they'd pick an elf, and it would be, a female elf and make her as sexy as possible. Now that I remember, that was a problem with gamers in the army of all places. So they were indulging something there. But most people were like, I want to be a cleric or, a dwarven fighter or a ranger or do all these sorts of things. And then you would act it out. So you have to exercise your own imagination. And then you have the game master who is also, subbing in for all these characters and monsters and setting up the scenario and running the play. They have to have an incredible imagination, and they might develop an entire world in which your campaign could take place. D&D was, as I mentioned, just the biggest and most successful of these kinds of games. They weren't just confined to fantasy, although there were some real interesting rivals. One that was set in, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was set in the ancient world that existed on Earth, and so you could be a Roman or a Parthian or whatever. There was Empire of the Petal Throne, which was its own really sophisticated, well-worked-out world-building game. I never got to play that one. There was, in space, of course, Games Designer Workshop's Traveler, which was really cool. There was Gamma World, a post-apocalyptic world. There was Boot Hill for gunfighters. There are all sorts of things like this. And in the 80s, this became big business, and they started rolling all sorts of things out. There was even a D&D cartoon, which was not particularly good. And, of course, you may remember with the satanic panic of the 80s, Dungeons and Dragons was also targeted for that. As a matter of fact, there were movies about how playing Dungeons and Dragons might make you lose your mind. Why? Because you were engaging in use of the imagination, and you were doing so in an interpersonal way. There was the actual gaming, and then there was, reading the texts involved with it and thinking about all this sort of stuff. I mean, there were game systems that I read about and never actually played, but I remember, reading the books and thinking, oh, cool, I would set this up in this way. So Bakker is coming out of a context in which all of this is part of what you're doing, and he's reading literature as well. So that's all part of it. This is in 1984. He first begins developing this. 1986, he goes off to college, enrolls in the University of Western Ontario, begins studying literature. Beginning studying literature is a bit of a misnomer because really nobody becomes a lit major if they don't already love literature, right? You can become a philosophy major without having read too much philosophy. I think it's more rare that somebody becomes an English or lit major without already having a solid engagement with that. And while he's there, he continues developing this world and the narrative for Earwa, the continent that this is on, and the Second Apocalypse. He begins developing out a history, and a history with many different perspectives and moving parts. Around 1990, it's a little bit hard to get very conclusive dates for this. He graduates with his bachelor's and enrolls as a master's student at the University of Western Ontario, studying literary criticism and theory. And so that's getting you a lot of philosophy stuff, but it's also getting you a lot of history, a lot of languages. So that's kind of a good fertile mix that we'll talk about in a bit. He also encounters some of the stuff that he's going to criticize later on under, the rubric of, say, postmodernism. Then in 1992, we're guessing, he graduates with his master's, and then he goes down to the United States and enrolls in philosophy at Vanderbilt University, a very good university in the Mid-South. And he stays there for about 4 years. He eventually leaves Vanderbilt, never does finish a dissertation. But, when you've read enough dissertations and then you compare it to this, I think he actually came out better on the deal. He retains a strong interest in philosophy the entire time. There is one other thing I'll say about Vanderbilt, too. So, I've known quite a few people from Vanderbilt because I was at Southern Illinois University and they were all part of the Mid-South region. Vanderbilt around that time would have had a number of different people representing different philosophical traditions, sort of like it was where I went to school at University of Illinois Carbondale. He would actually be leaving Vanderbilt shortly after I'm coming into Carbondale. They're both what we call pluralistic departments at that time. And as a matter of fact, we actually had some people hop back and forth from our school and their school. So he's continuing to work on all of these interesting projects, some of them sort of straight philosophy, philosophy of mind, consciousness, but also his narrative that he's got here. This is a good place to take a pause and read a few things from some interviews and excerpts. So he says in a science fiction and fantasy world interview, "For the longest time, I thought publication was a pipe dream, like saying, I want to be an astronaut in elementary school. I sent the original manuscript of The Prince of Nothing away once in my early 20s. I can't even remember to whom anymore. It was rejected. I remember that. But even then, I think I looked on the whole thing as an impossibility. I pretty much knew lousy writer was," he's got this in quotes, "and that the themes that I set myself were beyond my ability to explore in anything other than a hackneyed fashion. There was always this gap between what I wanted to write, the reflections, the feelings, the tapestry of actions, and what I was actually able to write. I never sent the manuscript out again. Instead, I started rewriting from the very beginning and elaborating and remolding the world of Earwa, and I continued doing this into my mid-30s. At this point, I regarded the project as little more than an embarrassing hobby. I was living with my fiancée, Sharon, and my dissolute ways had begun to dissolve. I discovered philosophy, the endorphins were coursing through my veins. I was hell-bent on becoming a professional academic. As strange as it may sound, this is when things clicked for me, writing-wise." So the Prince of Nothing becomes this entire 3-book series, and the darkness that comes before ends up being published in 2003. And this is a significant time after leaving Vanderbilt, right? ABD, we say, all but dissertation. You're supposed to be working on your dissertation at the time. And so I think it's kind of, interesting. He honed this. He reworked it. He also became, when you read about him saying, I wasn't that good of a writer. I couldn't, get the characters to do what I wanted. That's not here in this. He developed his skills in order to be able to do that. So another thing that I want to bring up here in terms of his own writing is something a little bit more big picture, then we'll come back to the biography. This is in Why Fantasy and Why Now. He tells us, "The power of science to monopolize rationality has reached such an extent that one can no longer ask what's the meaning of life and still be rational, thus the crisis of meaning. The world we live in has been revealed by science to be indifferent and arbitrary. Where we once lived in a world steeped in moral significance, Now we live in a world where things simply happen, where once the meaningfulness of life was an unquestioned certainty, the very foundation of rationality, now we must continually struggle to make our lives meaningful, and do so, moreover, without the sanction of rationality. Questions of the meaningfulness of life have retreated into the fractured realm of competing faiths and the New Age section of the bookstore. In our day and age, the truth claim, "My life has meaning," is as much an act of faith, that is to say, a belief without rational legitimation, as the truth claim, "There is a God." So then he says, it's no accident that fantasy is preoccupied with our pre-Enlightenment, pre-crisis past. The contemporary world is the nihilistic world, where all signs point to the illusory status of love, beauty, goodness, and so on. This is not to say that they are in fact illusory, only that at a fundamental level our culture is antagonistic to the claim that they are real. Nihilism is a fever in the bones of contemporary culture, afflicting all our assertions of meaningfulness with the ache that they are wrong. Fantasy is the celebration of what we no longer are. Individuals certain of our meaningfulness in a meaningful world. The wish fulfillment that distinguishes fantasy from other genres is not to be the all-conquering hero, but to live in a meaningful world. That is a great way of describing what the hell is going on in these books. There's, faith, there's philosophy, there's sorcery, there's, the meaningfulness of one's own life and living out a history in which one has been bruised and damaged. There's where you fit within your jockeying for power or prestige. All of these things are being played out by these characters. There's even the question of, is there any way out of this cycle? And that's a question that's being grappled with by some of the other characters. In addition to that, you have, sort of a world historical battle against evil, not by good, but by people who are somehow less bad, right? So there's all of these questions that are going on. And we see, in 2003, The Darkness That Comes Before comes out, 2005, The Warrior Prophet, continuing the story, 2006, The Thousandfold Thought. So that is a lot of narrative within a very short period of time. Around the same time, Bakker also begins interacting with his fans at the 3 C's forum that he creates, right? The 3 C's are part of the narrative universe. And then he takes a bit of a hiatus. He's writing other stuff. He's always actually constantly writing. But he brings out another book that's not in this series in 2008 called Neuropath. He retakes it up in 2009 with the first of the Unholy Consult, The Judging Eye. The next one in 2011, White Luck Warrior. And then in 2016, The Great Ordeal. And then finally, 2017, the last book in the series, The Unholy Consult. In the meantime, however, he begins a WordPress blog called The 3-Pound Brain, in which he's putting forth his ideas and speculations and also interacting with fans, but doing a lot of philosophy of mind in the process. Quite a few other books come out, The Disciple of the Dog. He's got some essays, The Blind Brain Theory, The Digital Dionysus, Nietzsche, and the Network-Centric Condition that are coming out. And, in 2017, he also published a piece in the Journal of Consciousness Studies called On Alien Philosophy. And it's quite interesting to see how well Bakker, like, quite a few other authors that we've looked at, embraced the digital age and used it in ways that would allow him to very closely engage with fans. He's actually got a really great discussion of this here in The Future of Literature in the Age of Information. He says that literary authors need to know their readers. They need to identify audiences possessing dissenting values and attitudes. Then they need to hijack or embrace the narrative forms most commonly marketed to them. And here he says something quite interesting about, high literature and academic stuff versus the much more widely read stuff that, fits into the genres like fantasy, right? He says, this means all the old and largely unfounded prejudices against genre fiction must be set aside. Genre only seems antithetical to literature because the literary, the academics, the opinion formers, have turned it into a flattering foil, abandoned it in effect, leaving a rhetorical fog of self-congratulation in their wake. He's saying something about our contemporary culture. He says, in my own case, I chose epic fantasy because I knew the best way to provoke readers with a narrative meditation on the nature and consequences of belief was to reach actual believers. And provoke I did. Other writers like China Miéville, M. John Harrison, Gene Wolfe, John Crowley, just to name a few, are doing the same thing, producing works that is obviously literary, openly provocative, yet unheard of in literary circles for the simple sin of wearing wrong generic skin. These are the writers who are genuinely shaking things up as opposed to hawking intellectual and aesthetic buzzes inside the literary echo chamber. I think this is actually dead on. A lot of the really important and interesting stuff is not happening in the high literature sanctum. It's happening in genre literature. He says, commercial genres must be seen for what they are, relatively fixed channels of communication to relatively dedicated audiences, not as cages preventing some mythic free expression, in quotes, right? All channels of communication force senders to play the game to reach a given group of receivers. English is such a game. The rules only seem coercive when you don't enjoy the game, or if you think it's stupid or beneath you. The literary author, he's talking about himself there, has to move past these old and embarrassing conceits. The idea is to play the margins, to play the game well enough to be identified as a trusted sender by the receiver. These are ideas in communication theory, right? All the while exploring ways to challenge their background assumptions. And then he goes on and he says, this is no easy task. Luckily, and now he talks about the internet, information technology has brought about a curious and potentially revolutionary reversal of the roles traditionally assigned to writers and readers. Before the internet, writers were almost exclusively senders, readers were almost exclusively receivers. The effort required to contact an author effectively restricted communication to fan mail and café clutches, is where you'd get together and drink coffee and chitter-chatter. And he said, this assured that most of the feedback a writer received would be complimentary, something useful for motivation, but not so useful for calibrating communicative tactics. Now, every author living is simply one vanity Google away from all stripes of unfiltered feedback from blogs, message boards, and special interest sites. And he mentions Goodreads in there. The internet allows a contemporary author to understand their readers better than at any time in modern history because it allows them to see the consequences of their artistic decisions. Write in a certain way, people get mad and they're like, this sucks. What's going on with this character? And they may be off base, but you can look at what they're saying and get it in not completely real time, but much closer time than writing letters. And then you can respond to it and incorporate that and think about it and reflect on it. So you can say that this series itself is, in large respect, the product of a lot of workshopping, a lot of reflection, a lot of reworking, and that these two volumes, the Warrior Prophet and the Thousandfold Thought, as well as the Darkness that comes before, are, in some respect, reactions to what he's trying out with fans as he builds his narrative universe. To finish up with this biography, Bakker tells us that, or Bakker actually doesn't tell us anything. That's me misspeaking there. He's been largely silent since 2017 and the arrival of the Unholy Consult. The finishing of that segment of the second apocalypse. Nobody really knows what's going on because those blogs and message boards, there isn't a lot of new movement on them. But there could be something else in the works. We don't really know. We have a lot of material to discuss, so the next thing we should move on to is this actual world of Earwa that Bakker created, at least the portion of it that we're going to glimpse here in the darkness that came before. So that's the darkness that comes before. So that means that we're going to talk about geography, we're going to talk about ethnography, we're going to talk about history, we're going to talk about the immediate situation, we're going to talk about the magic system, sorcery, we're going to talk about the religions. There's a lot of interesting things for us to go into. In each of the 3 sessions that we're going to devote to this trilogy by R. Scott Bakker, the majority of the discussion of world building is going to focus on what is revealed in each particular volume. And so there's going to be kind of an expansion of the world building going on and our exploration of that as more and more gets revealed, particularly through the thoughts and the discourses of the characters, and also the places that they traverse, which require there to be more discussion of what's going on. And I'm doing that in part because I don't want to try to throw everything at you at once any more than R. Scott Bakker himself does. However, I should preface this by saying that there are some instruments, you might say, that are provided in the work. So the first thing that I should mention is that in the 2nd and 3rd volume, there is a section beginning the books, which are really quite helpful, which are just called "What Has Come Before," and in those sections, he's not just narrating the plot, but also telling you, the important points that have been revealed about the nature of the world that he's going to be detailing more and more of in the 2nd and 3rd volume. I'll also point out as well that each volume contains some appendices that can be quite helpful, quite useful. There is, of course, a map. It's a fantasy book, so there has to be a map. But there is a character and faction glossary. There is major languages and dialects of Earwa, which is kind of useful as well. And then in addition to the maps, there's also Acamian's map given in this as well, which is being referenced at numerous points in this first book and in the other books. A map in that case is not a map of geography. It's actually a map of relations, a mind map, as we would call it. Then in the 2nd volume, The Warrior Prophet, you go towards the back and you will find another character and faction glossary, another map, which is, they're mostly the same thing. But in the 3rd volume, you'll find something a little bit more. It's an encyclopedic glossary. So this is R. Scott Bakker for, quite a few pages, actually. Here we go. Starts on page 405 of the work, and it goes on to page 503. So almost 100 pages of discussion, of entries, telling you more and more about what's going on. So, if you're the sort of person who wants to have a comprehensive understanding of that, you might actually jump to the 3rd book and, fill yourself in on all this sort of stuff. But if you're reading the works for the first time, you might be depriving yourself of the process of having this, this world continually revealed to you. So it's up to you what you want to do. So all of that said, let's talk about what we get in the darkness that comes before. I am going to say a few things about the world that are outside of the scope of the narration in this work, but just to help fill in a few things. So everything is taking place on this continent called, Earwa, and he provides you maps, of that. Beyond that, there's another continent that's separated from it from these mountains called Eana, and that's where men originally came from, with the exception of one race of men who already lived in Earwa. So that's happening there. And then the main action is happening around what are called the 3 C's. So there's three bodies of water that are connected with each other. There's all these kingdoms around it. They're mostly, well, actually, they are all human kingdoms, because the other main races that are involved in this really, they're not in those areas at all. And the continent, there's really we could say there's two parts of it. There's the high north, where humans used to live, and a few humans still do live, and that is dominated by these tribes of bestial creatures called the Srank. We'll talk about them in just a moment. It's also where the some of the important factions that are going to be playing a role, like what's left of the consult, exist, where the Dunyain exist, and where some of the non-men also are living as well. But we're going to put that aside. And then we have the three seas, this southern area, and then there's other areas on the map as well that are mentioned but not really explored, like Zaum. We'll talk about that very briefly, but that's going to play a bigger role, not actually in these books, but in the 4-book series that follows afterwards. So I mentioned races, and we can talk about race in two different senses in this work. There's races as in like ethnicities tied to genetic characteristics of human beings, and then there's actual other races involved as well. And we don't get to see very much of them. Early on, we actually do see a non-man encountered by Kelhus, the characters he's traversing his way south, but that's really about it. But the non-men are going to turn out to be incredibly important in the world that we are exploring here, and we'll talk about why in just a bit. But they've been in decline for a very long time. When they're encountered, they're still incredibly powerful compared to human beings. They had a well-developed culture long before human beings even began to be civilized, right? And then there's another race called the Inkaroi, and they were not originally from that planet. They crash-landed there. There's a whole story that'll be told more in subsequent sessions, but if you're interested, you can, again, jump ahead to the glossary at the end of Book 3. And they fight a war with the non-men. They also engage with human beings in certain ways, and they're going to become what is later on called the consult. So we're going to put that off for a bit. We've got these three main, races involved there, but for the most part, the Inkaroi and the non-men are just part of backstory. They're not really raising their heads too much at this point, except in very limited ways. There's also the weapon races, and the only one of these that we really get to glimpse in significant detail are the Srank. And the Srank are sort of like human beings, except they're, think about it as sort of like a cross between human beings and dogs in a way, and also pigs, smaller than human beings, ravenous. They've got wires crossed in their very brains that associate killing with sexual pleasure, and they're used as a weapon against the non-men, but they also wind up being a very potent weapon against human beings as well. And there's other weapon races that are developed by the Inkaroi using their techne, using their capacity for breeding these sorts of things. These include Raku, or dragons, which can get quite large in this narrative universe and be supremely powerful. Other very powerful beings. The ones that are particularly important for this story are the skin spies, and we really only get to see one or two of them in the story, right? They have this capacity to mimic anybody's faces because their face isn't a real face. It's really like a whole set of fingers that can move around and manipulate in different ways and then take on the aspects of a human being's face. And then there's something that's called a synthes, which allows some of the members of the consult to live on in these things that have like a human head and bird-like body, and sort of a repository for their minds. In addition to this, there's the Bashrag, but we'll talk about them more in other cases. So that's sort of the summary of the different races. Now let's talk about human beings. Before that, though, we should mention there's a lot of backstory to this, and so we can break this up into two main areas. We could talk about we could call it the historical and ethnographic stuff, and then we've got this other vaster history of the apocalypse and where we're going. This whole series is called the Second Apocalypse as well, so that's putting things into perspective. And the main aspects of world building that we want to attend to before we talk about the apocalypse is politics, religion, issues of class, the whole magic or sorcery system, and then how philosophy plays a role. But I should mention, and this is all I'm going to say about it here, is that one of the things that we're getting through the main character, Drusus Akamian, is, or Akka for short, I'm just going to call him Akka from this point on, which is the sort of term that Asimov uses for him. Actually, so do other characters who like him. He dreams every night of the first apocalypse, which has taken place millennia before, and he dreams the life of Sethwatha, who was one of the greatest sorcerers of the time, was close friends with the High King, and who was part of this almost decades-long period that comprised the first apocalypse. He was tortured by what became the Mandate. He's who are a member of another school that are allied with the Incaroi. He sees the No God, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit, who is, you might say, a centerpiece of the apocalypse. And this is part of what it means to be a Mandate schoolman, is that you dream these dreams every night, which allows you to know about the ancient history and know how bad it was, how horrifying things were. And it's part of the mission of the Mandate. And by framing it this way, having Akamian talk about the dreams and experience the dreams, Bakker is letting us see what the ancient history was like as well. So he's giving us a lens into how things are going. Let's talk about the races of human beings. That plays an important role in this. There are essentially 6 races of human beings, 2 of which really, you're not going to get any main discussion of until way, way, way later. So they're not that important. This would be the Mwama, who were the slaves of the non-men. They were the native inhabitant men of Earwa, and we see them much, much later on in the series of 4 books. Then there is, of the 5 races of men who come across the mountains through a gap and then invade, as quite primitive creatures, Earwa, when it's dominated by the non-men. Actually, one of the races of men don't cross over, and those are the Xiuhiani. They dwell beyond the Kyrsis Mountains, so they don't play any role in the story. But we have 4 main races of human beings. There's the Nosirai, who are light-skinned, often blonde, blue-eyed. They live in the high north, and they are the ones who originally make friends with the non-men. Who there's a thing called the non-men tutelage, where they're teaching the the Norserai. And there's only remnants left of them. We'll come to that in a moment. Then there's the Ketjai, the majority of the characters and peoples around the Three Seas that are taking part in this vast holy war that's really the centerpiece of this book are belonging to the Ketjai. There is the Sat-Yothi, who are largely represented by this kingdom of Zaum, which we don't really learn much about. They don't effectively play a role. And then there's the Skilvendi. And the Skilvendi are very interesting. They are, fair-skinned, dark-haired, and they are essentially a wandering, nomadic, predatory people who live for war, who view war as a holy pilgrimage and fight against everybody else. And they were on the side of the non-god, the no-god, and the consult, what was going to become the consult later on, during the apocalypse. And so, in a way, they're sort of like enemies of all other men, all other human beings. So you've got all of these things going on, and the Norserai, the Noserai have largely been destroyed in the north. The exceptions to this would be the Dunyain, who have retreated into this stronghold that they have to carry out their monastic life, and then two cities that are still left in the north, Atrithau and Sakarpus. Sakarpus is going to play a major role in the later four books. Atrithau is just a place for Calhus to be at for a short time, but he claims to be the Prince of Calhus. That's why he's the Prince of Nothing, right? It's a city that nobody knows anything about because it's so far north. It's away from the Three Seas. There are some Noserai nations around the Three Seas, Galiath, Thunarus, and Kitaidon, and they contribute troops and commanders and plot points, you could say, to the holy war that's going to take place, because all of the Three Seas are being united against one of the southern kingdoms, Khian. So that's a good segue into talking about the Ketjai. So the Ketjai are more dark-skinned and darker hair, brown eyes, that sort of thing. The biggest kingdom is indeed Khian, which we're going to talk about in a bit, because the Holy War is directed against them, and so it plays a very important role. Then there's also the Nansur Empire, which has lost a number of its provinces to Khian, wants to get them back. It's sort of modeled after the Byzantines, just like Khian is sort of modeled after the Muslim Caliphate. And then we have other places like Conria, which was at one time the center of an empire. We have High Ion, which is also an important place, which is dominated by a school of sorcerers that we'll get to in a bit. And then we have Nilamesh, which is to the south of Khian. And they're kind of their own show. They don't really enter much into the story in these works. And so, between the various Noserai nations around the Three Seas, the Nansur Empire, Khian, and Konira and Ainon, we have the big players, what are often called the great factions in this story. So this is a good lead into politics. What is the politics? Well, we have an emperor who is, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes, not that acknowledged, and he's got his own court and all that. And then we've got these other countries around the Three Seas. We've got Khian to the south, which is fighting this constant battle. We have the Skilvendi raiding everybody that they can and, attacking them. The Khianese have lost an important battle against them. The Nansur Empire has lost battles against them, but they're going to crush the Skilvendi under Koniras, the nephew of the emperor, in this. And then what else? We have rivalries going on between all of these other countries, but they're being united for a great holy war of all of these nations against Khian. And the empire is trying to take advantage of this to, require the provinces that are gained to be given back to them. The other main countries are not so into that. And there's an interesting discussion of a game called Benjuka, which gets brought up by Cinemus, who is a Conrian noble and friend of Drusus Acamian, and actually they were tutors of Proyas, who's a very important character in this when they were younger, and they're friends and they play this game together. And Benjuka, you have to imagine an incredibly complex game where the rules themselves change over time, and it's being used as a metaphor for what's happening politically. There's a lot of political machinations happening in this. And again, how do we view this? Well, Bakker has the characters talk to each other about their plans and their plots and what might be going on, the possibilities. And some of them are mistaken about things. As we're going to talk about in a bit, one of the key themes running throughout these works is mistaking who your genuine enemies are. So there's all this political stuff going on, and we should talk about religion next, since there's a unification of sorts that's taking place because of this holy war. So there's several main religions that are coming up in this storyline. One, let's talk about Khian. So I mentioned that Khian as a country is largely modeled after the Muslim Caliphate, and one of the things that we can say about Islam that's similar to what's called Fanimri, which was founded by this prophet. Fane, is that it's totally monotheistic. It's radically monotheistic. It looks at the 1,000 temples of the north, and it says that's idolatry. There's only one God, and we have to, stamp out all of this heathen stuff. And so they go on jihads, and they're actually called jihads in this book. Again, very similar connections. And they take over provinces, and including some of the main holy cities of the other main rival religion, which is called Inrithism, founded by this prophet Sejanus. And Sejanus, in effect, says, listen, there's all these different cults and temples. They're all aspects of the same one God. So there's, why do the Fanim have a problem with this? Because there's still all of these different cults around. They're just unified into one giant structure, which has its own overarching political structure and treasury and all of these other things going on. Its own schools. The cults sometimes, get a little big for their britches, as we're going to see later on in some of these. And this goes back to a document which is on literally a tusk, the holy tusk, written, when men were still young, in this script that it's like, kept in the holiest of holies. And the tusk, think of that as their Bible, right? And there's a lot of verses in the tusk that say things like, don't allow whores to live, stone them. Sorcery is an abomination. Don't allow the non-men to live because they're bad as well. And so you've got this religious document, and then all these different cults and lowercase g gods, you could say, that are all understood as aspects of the one God. Now, the Inrithism does have a central figure who is called the Shira. And the Shiras are sort of like popes, right? Except think of them as a pope presiding over a whole host of other, loosely connected religions, and kind of keeping order. And sometimes the popes are corrupt. Sometimes they're actually just tools of the non-Sir Emperor. So we see a lot of the, historical, Holy Roman Emperor versus the Pope sort of thing, or the ruler of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire and the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the other patriarchies that he took over at different times. We see a similar thing going on here. And in this case, we have a powerful Shira, Maithanet, who declares a holy war against the Fanim. And at first they're worried that the holy war is going to be against the schools of sorcery. We'll talk about them in just a moment. But it turns out it's against the Fanim. And so nobles and people from all over start gathering within the Non-Ser Empire to go south and fight against the Fanim. And they don't actually get that far. The first wave of them gets wiped out. The Vulgar Holy War. And by the end of this book, we were getting ready to see the conflict actually take place. It's just been gathering and marching south. The Skilvendi also have their own religion. They worshipped the no god, and when the no god was destroyed, they continued to worship him. And all of that continues to play a really significant role. The Skilvendi, before they're effectively defanged by as I mentioned, the brilliant general, who is the nephew of the current emperor, they go on pilgrimage and they bring death and destruction to the south. Class also plays a role. We mostly get to see the nobles, but we do get to see some ordinary people. Esimet, for example, is a prostitute. Other people have come from less noble beginnings. There's this entire structure, you could call it, an etiquette called Nyan that plays a role in this, and there's all these different gradations. The people who are powerful generally tend to be, for the most part, obsessed with like jockeying for power and prestige. Quite a few of them are a bit foolish in how they do that. And so that there's not that much more to be said about that, I think, at this point. We really do need to talk about sorcery, though. So sorcery plays an incredibly important role in this, and it's a major feature of this universe. Sorcery originally comes from the teaching of the non-men to human beings of what they learned of sorcery. Sorcery is a way of using language to change reality, to bruise reality. And the gods don't really like it, and there are gods, right? Because it's changing the nature of the universe that the gods created. The non-men in their time were very potent sorcerers. As a matter of fact, Calhus encounters a non-man who uses some sorcery, and here we go. The Dunyain, I'm always mixing these funny names up. They actually think there is no sorcery, and so Calhus, encounters and is like, wow, this stuff actually does exist. Achmanian is one of the most, he belongs to one of the most powerful schools in terms of the kind of sorcery that they have. So before we talk about these different schools, the human beings that can do sorcery are called the few. They have a different sort of insight into reality, a deeper insight into the onta, how things actually are. And they have the capacity through language and singing to change those sorts of things. When they do, this produces something called the mark, or a bruise upon reality. And so there are several different kinds of sorcery out there that play a role in this. There's the gnosis, which is represented pretty much only by the mandate, one of the few surviving schools of the High North, where there was this collaboration between non-men and human beings, the Nosirai, who became sorcerers. There was another major school of Gnostic sorcery who went over to the bad side with the Inkiroi and eventually will become the Consult. And the Consult is sort of an alliance between Inkiroi, renegade or broken down non-men who've abandoned their thing, and we'll talk about why that's the case later on in a different session. And then human beings belonging to that school who joined them. that becomes the consult. And so these two schools are sort of rivals with each other, but nobody's seen the consult for centuries and centuries. As a matter of fact, the mandate's not quite sure. It's sort of an article of faith for them that the mandate exists, but they don't really know. As it turns out, they do exist, as we find out in this. Then there are the anagogic or anagnostic schools as well. The Scarlet Spires is one of these. Their stuff is not as powerful as the Gnosis. It's in some respect not as perfect of a tool, right? So a Gnostic sorcerer can probably face off against a number of anagogic sorcerers. And so this includes the Scarlet Spires, who are so strong that they actually basically control the kingdom of High Ion. They are the most potent of these. The Imperial Psyche, it's a school of sorcerers who serve the empire. And then there are the Mycenae, known as the mercenary sorcerers, and there are other schools that we find out about, but they're not mentioned really in this particular volume. On the other side, with the Fane himself was the first of these. There are the Cisarum, and they have a different thing going on. They've blinded themselves. They see through the eyes of little snakes, asps that they have, in order that they can better see the universe as it is, and they talk about the divine water, letting that flow, and what they're doing is a different kind of sorcery that doesn't leave a mark. And so this raises some serious security issues for some of the other things, particularly the Scarlet Spires. And there's a war going on at the beginning between the Cisarum and the Scarlet Spires in the background. I'll also mention, too, that the other schools often try to kidnap mandate sorcerers to try to get the gnosis from them. Then another really key thing are what are called the trinkets or the chori, and this is the result of another kind of sorcery that's been lost. These are little balls that one carries around with them, and they can even be fitted to arrowheads and then shot at a sorcerer. If they touch a sorcerer, they turn the sorcerer into salt. And so they're effectively sorcery killers. And so long as they're held on one's person, they prevent that person from being affected by sorcery. So that's an important aspect as well. The no god was actually, within a sarcophagus that incorporated a lot of chori, so couldn't be affected by sorcery at all. So that's a major part of this, and we get a lot of explanations about how sorcery works in the course of this book, but what we're getting there is just sort of pulling the curtain back compared to what we're going to get in the other books. The system is quite developed, we'll say, in R. Scott Bakker. The last thing that we should talk about in terms of world building is the role of philosophers. Now, there are some philosophers who get mentioned at the beginning of chapters. There's all sorts of interesting things. You've seen this done by other authors. For example, by in the Dune series, right? There's oftentimes little things about this. So there's historians, there's philosophers. There's also things from Drusus Akamian, where he's telling the story, and he's kind of a philosopher himself. But they mention, too, Agencus and then his disciple Parcus, who play a role. The non-men are supposed to have developed philosophy on their own, but we really don't know much about it. There is, however, a lot of important discussion, in fact, even chapters devoted to this, on the part of the Dunyain. And we get a sort of here's how Kelhus developed, right? So who are these Dunyain? Well, they are essentially monks, but philosophers who have withdrawn into a stronghold up in the high north after the destruction of the human empires up there by the No God and the Srank and all these other big baddies, right? They withdrew 2,000 years ago into their stronghold, and they are developing themselves philosophically, also through martial arts, also through selective breeding, and their goal is to realize the absolute. And so two main characters are part of that. Both of them are members of the, so you could say they're descended from the ruling party of the Great North. Actually, one of them plays part of a prophecy, right? And so each of them is their surname is Anasurambor, and so Kelhus is the younger one. His father Mengus is down in among the Chianese and the Cisarum, down in this holy city, but they both belong to this important group that we're going to talk about in a bit, because this is one of the important philosophical themes that we're going to expose in this work. So that's enough about the world building, I would say. There is a vast host of philosophical themes that are woven into this book, The Darkness That Comes Before. No big surprise given Bakker's background in philosophy, right? So there's all sorts of ethical quandaries and issues and distinctions, and a lot of epistemological stuff. There's plenty of metaphysics in here as well. I decided that in order to try to keep it manageable, I would talk about three main sets of themes, and I associate each of these with a particular main character of the work and indeed of the entire Second Apocalypse series. So we have Anasurambor Kelhus, who is the Prince of Nothing, that the Prince of Nothing series is named after. And this darkness that comes before is part of the discourses that he's centered within. And so we can talk about him and his training as one of the Dunyain. And then what happens when he goes out into the world, as well as what happens with his father, Anasurambor Mengus. So that's really about the nature of philosophy in a world that doesn't know philosophy as such. Philosophy as, you could say, both contemplative or theoretical and practical. So that's one key theme. Another, I would say, centers around one of the other people who's arguably even more of a main character, and that is Drusus Akamian, right? The mandate schoolman and sorcerer who is also a spy who follows along with the Holy War, the lover of Esimet, and what can we call that theme? It's an epistemological theme dealing with knowledge, but again, there's a practicality to it. And we could say that one of the key questions of this is, well, what is actually going on and how do we know this to be the case, particularly as we go deeper and deeper and deeper into what is truly happening behind the scenes. And this is a very common sci-fi and fantasy and horror theme. It's sort of a mainstay of speculative fiction, plots within plots within plots and revelation. So I would say knowledge, trust, and who the real threat or enemy is the theme to associate with Akamian. And then we have Knair, the self-proclaimed most violent of men, the Skilvendi. And there we can talk about conflict, death, war, and its role as violence, but also intellect. So we have, in some respect, three different, I don't want to say philosophies as like worldviews, although they are different worldviews, but approaches to the use of the human mind are articulated in this. And all three of them are indeed, they have a theoretical dimension to them, but they're all inherently practical. So let's talk first about the Dunyain, this people who have withdrawn into a stronghold up in the high north, after the first apocalypse and have been engaging in training. The Dunyain are people who are, as they say, surrendered to the Logos. And what is the Logos, and what does it mean to be surrendered to it? So here's from Kalhus himself. He says, the Dunyain have surrendered themselves to the Logos, to what you would call reason and intellect. We seek absolute awareness, the self-moving thought. The thoughts of all men arise from the darkness. If you are the movements of your soul, and the cause of that movement precedes you, then how could you ever call your thoughts your own? How could you be anything other than a slave to the darkness that comes before? The title of this very book, right? And he says, only the Logos allows one to mitigate that slavery. Only knowing the sources of thought and action allows us to own our thoughts and actions, to throw off the yoke of circumstance. And only the Dunyain possess this knowledge, plainsmen. He's talking to Knayer, right? He's explaining things. The world slumbers, enslaved by its ignorance. Only the Dunyain are awake. Mengus, my father, threatens this. And this is a really key theme. So, this ties in with this notion of, is philosophy supposed to be primarily speculative, contemplative, theoretical? Or is it something that, while it has that aspect, that's within a larger practical frame? And you can say, so long as you don't know why you're doing theoretical philosophy, or any other thing for that matter, you're in some respect kind of a prey to all the outside forces that are causing you to do what you do, or the composition of your mind, how you're handling trauma, how you're making sense out of your own history. And so that is what these people are attempting to do, and we get to see Kalhus getting trained in this in chapter 17. I'm not going to talk too much about this just to keep this fairly short, but that is a key chapter to look at. So here's a great example. He's told as a young boy, to meditate on the Logos is without beginning or end. He has to do this over and over and over again. And as he does it, he says, long afterward he would realize this exercise that demarcated his soul. The incessant repetition of the pragma's proposition pitted himself against himself, shown him the extent to which he was other to himself. For the first time he could truly see the darkness that had preceded him, and he knew that before this day he had never truly been awake. And so this puts him at an incredible advantage over other human beings. The Dunyain are like adults to children, as Knayer realizes. Kalhus, early on in the book, we have, what comes before determines what comes after. Dunyain monks spent their lives immersed in the study of this principle, illuminating the intangible mesh of cause and effect that determined every happenstance, minimizing all that was wild and unpredictable. Because of this, events always unfolded with granitic certainty in issue, right? And he says, to know what would come after was the beauty that stilled the hallowed communion of intellect and circumstance, the gift of the Logos. So by engaging in this sort of study that gives him, all sorts of other advantages too, being able to be a great martial artist, he acquires an insight into human psychology. He's able to pull at the strings. He's able to tell what's going on, what's motivating people. He can't do it all immediately at once. He has to make certain approaches to it, right? Just as much as his father did with Knayer 30 years earlier. I want to bring up something else about this self-mover thing. So there is somebody else who's mentioned as a self-mover in this, or at least not as a self-mover, but in terms of not being moved by others. And that is the imperial general, General Exalt, Confus, right? His uncle, Xerius, is thinking about this. He says his nephew was never moved by another. Confus was moved by Confus, even if at times in mimicry of being moved by others. He was a man for whom everything was a whim, a perfect man. Now, is he really a perfect man, or is this the flawed perspective of the emperor? That's going to turn out that way. Kellhus, a little bit later in the book, we find this nice passage. Here it is, where Kellhus himself is one of the people who is able to move the souls of men. And how is Akamian finding this out? By teaching Kellhus, right? So that's pretty important. Kellhus is a person who can move the souls of others. And later on, towards the very end of it, remember, Kellhus's goal is actually to take over the Holy War and use it as an instrument to get to Shimei, to his father. Here's the last thing we'll say. For Kellhus, each of the great names represented a question, a juncture of innumerable permutations. In their faces, he saw fragments of other faces surfacing as though all men were but moments of one man. An instant of Lewith passing like a squall through Athgeri's skull as he argued with Salbone. A glimpse of Serway in the way Guthalich looked on his youngest son. The same passions, but each cast in dramatically different balance. Any one of these people might be as easily possessed as Lewith had been despite their fierce pride, but in their sum they were incalculable. They were a labyrinth, 1,000 halls, and he had to pass through them. He had to own them. So he had to be able to figure out what, as we say, makes people tick, what motivates them, and then get them all going in the right direction. And this is an incredibly complex problem. So that's one really important thematic, let's say, of the work. Let's turn now to Akamian, because he's a really interesting character. He's a mandate sorcerer, so he's very powerful. At the same time, he gets kicked around an awful lot, in part because of the circumstances. You can't solve most problems with sorcery. And he's also a spy. He's detailed on missions by the Mandate, who are in this war that they're not even sure is still going on, because they're not sure that the consult still exists. And one of the key issues in this work is knowing who the real enemy is. As it turns out, the consult does still exist. And they are far more evil than any of the people that you might elevate as being evil. If you're the northern parts of the Three Seas, the Fanim, you see them as evil, but they're not really evil the way that the consult is, who want to raise the no-god. The Srank are clearly evil, this monster race of subhuman things. The non-men, they're arguably at certain points evil. Certainly the Inrithism casts them that way. But you notice the different groups of sorcerers, the Scarlet Spires think that it's the Cisarum who are, sending the skin spies and all that. Same with the Empire. So there's a lot of misrecognition of who the real enemy is. And it turns out that the Mandate was right all this time. The consult, this group of people that are sort of an incorporation of these evil sorcerers from a previous Gnostic school, the non-men who have become erratic, and the Incaroi, who are horrible things to begin with, are out there and are manipulating things as things are going on. So Akmanian finds this out. And part of how he discovers this is one of the skin spies who Kellhus is able to see, because he can see that this thing doesn't really have a face. It just has, these finger-like things that can set up expressions that fool people. Now, Akmanian himself has a lot of tools at his disposal. And, there's a couple things that get brought up here. There are a couple passages I wanted to call attention to. So the first one is early on in the book, and it's about the great factions and the Mandate itself. He says, How could he not be cynical? In the Three Seas, all the great factions warred with tangible foes for tangible ends, while the Mandate warred against a foe no one could see for an end no one believed in. This made Mandate schoolmen outcast not only in the way of sorcerers, but also in the way of fools. Of course, the potentates of the Three Seas, Ketyai and Norserai alike, knew of the consult and the threat of the second apocalypse, but they did not believe. After centuries of skirmishing with the Mandate, the consult had simply disappeared, vanished. No one knew why or how, though there had been endless speculation. Had they been destroyed by forces unknown? Had they annihilated themselves from within? Or had they simply found a way to elude the eyes of the Mandate? It had been 3 centuries since the Mandate had last encountered the consult. For 3 centuries, they'd waged a war without a foe. So that's part of the backdrop. He also engages in this interesting process of what we nowadays recognize as mind mapping. And this starts on page 267 and goes through to here we go, page 270. And I'll just read a little bit of this. He says, Achmanian often made such maps not because he worried he might forget something, but because he was worried he would overlook something. Visualizing connections, he found, always suggested further possible connections. Moreover, this simple exercise had often proved a valuable guide for his inquiries in the past. So, he's trying to map out all the things that are connected to each other. As a matter of fact, there's a map of it contained in one of the appendices in the back. Another thing that I brought up earlier is this game, Benjuka, and there's some discussion of it. Here we go. Benjuka was a relic, a survivor of the end of the world that had been played in the courts of Tirsa, Atrio, and Metzonk before the apocalypse, much as it was now studied in the gardens of Carthsal, Nenkefan, and Momen now. But what distinguished Benjuka was not its age. In general, there was a troubling affinity between games and life, and nowhere was this affinity more striking or more disturbing than in Benjuka. Like life, games were governed by rules. But unlike life, games were utterly defined by those rules. The rules were the game, and if one played by different rules, one simply played a different game. Since a fixed framework of rules determined the meaning of every move as a move, games possessed a clarity that made life seem a drunken brawl by comparison. Right? The cunning of Benjuka lay in the absence of this fixed framework. Rather than providing an immutable ground, the rules of Benjuka were yet another move within the game, yet another piece to be played. And this made Benjuka the very image of life, a game of baffling complexities and near poetic subtleties. Other games could be chronicled as shifting patterns of pieces and number stick results. Benjuka gave rise to histories. And so Benjuka itself is sort of a metaphor for what Achmanian is trying to discern through this, and what Kelhus is trying to make sense of as well, this shifting pattern of human history. In this case, of course, Kelhus is motivated by the Logos and finding his father and taking over the Holy War for his own purposes. Achmanian is motivated by a whole host of concerns, including love for different people, his students, for Esamet, the horror of the apocalypse that he revisits every night in his dreams as Seswatha, who lived through the apocalypse, and he's got to try to get through to the right people about what's going on. In another passage that I want to bring up, he talks with Proyas, who he had been the teacher of, and he tells him that the Holy War might not be what it seems, and then Proyas says, with mock astonishment, not what it seems. For the emperor, the Holy War is a lecherous means to restore his empire. For so many of my peers, it's simply a venal instrument of conquest and glory. For Eleazaris and the Scarlet Spires, it's a vehicle for some arcane who knows what. And for so many others, it's a cheap way to redeem a squandered life. The Holy War is not what it seems. There hasn't been a night, Achmanian, when I haven't prayed that you're right. The crown prince leaned forward and poured himself a bowl of wine. And then he says, prayers are never enough, are they? Something will happen, some treachery or small atrocity, and my heart will cry, fie on this, damn them all. And you know what, Achmanian? It's a possibility that saves me, that drives me to continue. What if? I ask myself, what if this holy war is, in fact, divine, a good in and of itself? Achmanian says that's impossible, but this is his former student. And instead, there's a different kind of holy war that's going on that Achmanian is trying to chart out. So, there's a lot to unpack there. Let's jump now, however, to one of the other great characters sketched out in here, and that is, I want to get his full name right, Cnai'r Usciotha, right? Or we'll just call it Cnai'r after this. The most violent of men, and one of the Skilvendi chieftains, chief of the tribe of the Utamat, who is going to be wiped out. Now, he is a very interesting character because he gets led astray from the traditional Skilvendi way of living by this Dunean, right, who is there and becomes a slave of him. And what we see going on here is that he gets a metaphor laid out for him, a metaphor of the grasslands, the steppes. And the Skilvendi are very tradition-bound. They do the same thing over and over and over again. And here we go. Mangus spoke about many things over the months that followed, about how men slumbered, about how the logos, the way of intellect, was the only thing that could awaken them. But all of it was a blur to Cnai'r now. Of all their secret transactions, he remembered only the first with any clarity. When the warriors raid the empire across the mountains, Mangus said, they always use the same trails, do they not? Yes, of course, but why? Cnai'r shrugged. Because the trails are mountain passes. There's no other way to cross into the empire. When the warriors gather to raid their neighbors' pastures, they always use the same trails, do they not? No. Why not? Because they ride over open ground. The ways of crossing the steep are without number. Exactly, Mangus exclaimed. And is not every task like a journey, every accomplishment a destination, every hunger a point of departure? So he says, here we go, make your point, slave. Do you see you grow impatient because you think the path I take too convoluted? Even words are like journeys. So if all things men do are journeys, here's the master metaphor, I ask you, why are the ways of the Skilvendi, the customs that bind what men do, like mountain passes? Why do they ride the same trails over and over again when the ways to their destination are without number? And here we get something really interesting going on. For some reason, this question thrilled Cnai'r. The words were so audacious he felt bold for simply hearing them, so compelling he felt at once exhilarated and aghast, and though they had touched a place that ached to be touched, the more because it was forbidden. The ways of the people, he'd been told, were as immutable and sacred as the ways of the outlander were fickle and degenerate. But why? Weren't these ways simply trails used to reach similar destinations? What made the Skilvendi way, the only track an upright man might follow? And how could this be when the trackless steep dwelt, as the memorialist said, in all things Skilvendi? For the first time, Cnai'r saw his people through the eyes of an outsider. How strange it all seemed, right? And he says, for the first time, he truly asked why. And this liberates him in a very interesting way. It also winds up being a trick and a trap at the same time. This corrosive effect of asking why, of reason, that we see in philosophy, leads to a kind of nihilism, doesn't it? Now, we also find out that in the battle between the imperial forces, led by Corfus, and the Skilvendi, when the Skilvendi are essentially broken and destroyed, he's there on the battlefield, and he gets to hear a discourse between Martimus and Confus. And so Martimus says, here we go. Actually, we'll skip ahead a little bit here. Confus says that if I were to tell you all that I know, you'd still suffer the same deficit. Answers are like opium. The more you imbibe, the more you need, which is why the sober man finds solace in mystery. And then Martimus says, at the very least, you could explain to me how you could have known that we'd win. So here's what Confus says. As I said, the Skilvendi are obsessed with custom. That means they repeat Martimus. They follow the same formulas time and again. Do you see? They worship war, but they have no understanding of what war truly is. What is war truly? Intellect. Martimus, war is intellect. This is something that Canayer is hearing as he's laying there being mistaken for a corpse. And this is going to be repeated when he has his sort of conflict between, of words essentially, between the exalt general being put out as, the champion, the leader of the Holy War, and where he's being proposed as a leader as well. The Holy War is really this, this massive thing that is being substantified. It's a host of human beings. It's also a direction. And the question is, who is going to manage it? Who is going to run it? Who is going to animate it with intelligence? And there's a number of different possibilities. There's the Nanser Empire, right? And, Confus has just been successful over the Skilvendi. He seems like just the person to lead. His troops love him, will follow him to the death, are loyal to him rather than to the empire. Then there's Proius, right? And Proius represents real faith, not the fake faith of the emperor. And Proius proposes something different instead. This is towards the end where we're seeing this culmination of this great war council. And here we go. Proius says, the great names lead. The Skilvendi will be our advisor. And then the emperor says, an outrage still, an army with 10 generals, when you founder, and you will, for you know not the cunning of the Chianine, to whom will you turn, a Skilvendi? And then Proius says, you'd speak of outrage to us? You'd school in piety those who'd sacrifice their very lives for the tusk? What of your iniquities, a Curie? What of you who'd make a tool of the holy war? And they're going back and forth. Then what does the Skilvendi actually have to say in all of this? What does he contribute? He gives a speech after a lot of back and forth that's quite important. Here we go. He's being asked what he's going to do. And he says, I was without my tribe, so I accepted the wager of Kelhus. And then they say, what wager? And the wager is that this war would be unlike any other. It would be a revelation. War is a religious phenomenon. And then Gatian, who's the representative of Maithanet, the Shira, right? He says, I see. And Canayer says, do you? I do not think so. I remain a Skilvendi. Do not mistake me, Inrithi. In this much Confus is right. You are all staggering drunks to me, boys who would play at war when you should kennel with your mothers. You know nothing of war. War is dark, black as pitch. It is not a god. It does not laugh or weep. It rewards neither skill nor daring. It is not a trial of souls nor the measure of wills. Even less is it a tool, a means to some womanish end. It is merely the place where the iron bones of the earth meet the hollow bones of men and break them. You have offered me war, and I have accepted. Nothing more. I will not regret your losses. I will not bow my head before your funeral pyres. I will not rejoice at your triumphs, but I have taken the wager. I will suffer with you. I will put Phantom to the sword and drive their wives and children to the slaughter. And when I sleep, I will dream of their lamentations and be glad of heart. Now, what's going on there? This sort of, almost like Conan, what is good in life, driving your enemies and hearing the lamentations of their women kind of moment. This is the product of the people of war having been influenced by the logos, by what that makes available. Canius is a different kind of Skilvendi, but he is a Skilvendi. What we have here in these three characters and in the three themes that I've just laid out are, you might say, approaches to different kinds of wisdom that all are connected with each other, play off of each other, but reveal different sides of reality and human history. That's part of what is woven into this pretty amazing book. And I think with that, this is a good place for us to end this particular discussion. Some of these themes will come up again and be reworked in the next 2 volumes as well. And there's plenty of other really important philosophical themes that we're going to introduce in addition to those as well.